A graduate of Rhodes University, Spicer also holds the position of Vice President at Business Unity South Africa. This is Captains of Industry. Let's start with how you managed to coordinate the diaries of all these CEOs and get them together around a forum when you represent 80 of the country's largest companies, including those foreign players.
Only way is to be absolutely authoritarian about it and to choose a date and say, guys, shape up or ship out, because otherwise, as you point out, it's clearly impossible to coordinate for everybody. So what we try to do is, frankly, we do a matrix and we try to arrange things so that they can make at least 3 of our 6 board meetings a year.
Give us some insight into what takes place at a business leadership forum. You've got very strong personalities that you obviously are dealing with.
Absolutely. So you really are reliant. We have an even stronger executive committee meeting, and we need some leadership from them. So some of our key players like Bobby Godsall or Pat Davies or Jacka Marie, we look to them to give a lead and to try to create a framework around which the other CEOs can operate. And we have very robust debates, as you would expect, with personalities like that. But I think they're there because they believe in the utility of collective leadership and collective playing. They're not there simply to play their sort of solo CEO role.
You mentioned collective leadership, but can business really ever speak with one voice? Surely there are too many differing agendas on the table.
No, I think at the highest level of national interest goals, you can speak with one voice. On issues like energy, you can clearly speak on one voice because it's in everyone's interest that we have uninterrupted, reasonably priced sources of energy. When it gets to issues like the value of the rand, clearly that's where interest groups diverge. And we've had some fascinating debates on the currency and whether it should be devalued. If so, how would you do that? And that's where we've parted ways.
Let's focus on energy and what business in this country can do to ensure that we have uninterrupted power supply going forward in the country.
Well, we've lent a couple of our top brains. Firstly, Russ Myberg, who was the head of Kumba, was seconded in to solve the coal procurement problem, and I think he's done that. Then Bobby Godsall spent a stint which ended in difficulty.
Can we say tears?
Yes, in tears for some. So we've helped provide some leadership, but beyond that, I think we've provided some strategic thinking. Most recently, Jayendra Naidu, one of our executive committee members, has become the energy czar, so to speak. And what he's done is to bring together the best thinking of the top energy consumers. And we're working together with government on a very exciting plan to find, quote unquote, 5,000 megawatts of energy. And it's through a variety of efficiencies, savings, contributions from own production over the next 18 months, which is the critical period. And government's bought into that plan. And I'm quite hopeful we'll find enough energy to tide us through that.
Has business geared up for another power shortage in the country?
Everybody is entirely alert on this. Of course, we want to avoid it if at all possible. And there are various mechanisms that have been discussed and plans that are in preparation if the worst comes to the worst. But we're going to do everything to avoid that. Besides
power, water is also on the agenda, and apparently that is the next looming crisis.
Yes.
Are you guys on top of that?
We commissioned probably a year, 18 months ago, Nick Siegel, who was formerly head of the UCT Graduate School of Business, to do a study for us. And we've used that as partly a platform for engagement with government to sensitize them, and I think they were sensitized to some extent already, but also to get further input from a variety of other players, such as the Centre for Development and Enterprise have held a round table. Gibbs has picked it up. And so I think we're seeing some grassroots activity, all focused at getting our performance up in the water area.
I mentioned earlier that you represent the 80 largest companies in South Africa, and that includes the foreign players. How do the foreign agendas differ to those of the South African companies?
Well, naturally they're here because they're major players in the South African market, but I think what they bring to the table is a global perspective. Clearly a number of South African companies are also global players now, but it's always useful in domestic debates to get the comparative analysis from companies. For example, I mentioned Unilever, who will say, no, but we've done that in Indonesia or India, We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can bring that experience to bear in South Africa. So
and are South African CEOs willing to learn from that foreign experience?
Absolutely. I think they're much more open-minded than they used to be. Of course, we had in the bad old apartheid days, a very much an introverted hothouse economy. We're much more globally oriented now, and we understand the need to get the best practice from wherever it is.
What are the thoughts among the CEOs of the sustainability of this global recovery? There's much debate as to whether we're going to see a double-dip recession. What do you feel the general sentiment is on the ground, so to speak?
Look, I think cautious optimism is perhaps the watchword. Business people generally are positive people, they're action-oriented people, so they're inclined to take the half full rather than half empty glass perspective. But cautious is also because they're aware of the many risks, and there are big risks out there. But they don't want to be paralyzed by that, so they take whatever risk mitigation strategies they can, but they're always exploring for opportunities at times of challenges. And sometimes those are precisely the moments when you can do the best business.
You have been quoted as saying that business leadership must choose its fights carefully. What are you prepared to challenge head on?
Look, I think one of the things we're very concerned about is the legislative process in South Africa. We clearly, after the apartheid period, we needed change. But you can't just have change across the board in everything instantaneously. And a lot of very ambitious legislation has been put on the books without adequate thought, particularly for unintended consequences. You're sounding like an economist. I'm going to ask you to give me a little bit more clarity on the legislation front. Well, yeah, sure. I'll give you some examples. But, you know, a lot of legislation does have unintended consequences. And in some countries, mechanisms have been put in place. Britain and others use what they call regulatory impact assessments. And all legislatures have to go through a process of saying why this legislation is necessary. It has to go through a series of filters to ensure that there won't be unintended consequences. It has to have a business plan, so to speak, and demonstrate that it can be implemented. Now, those are things that are not happening here. And so a lot of legislation does have lots of unintended consequences that then in turn requires further legislation and regulation, and that's all adding to the cost and complexity of doing business. Give me an example. So, what do you feel is unwieldy legislation in South Africa? Okay, so we are busy at the moment in two particular pieces of legislation. One was in fact passed after major complaints. That's the new Competition Amendment Act. Now, in the end, I think we agreed on most parts, but there are 2 or 3 provisions that are clearly unconstitutional, and we have a number of senior council opinions demonstrating that they're unconstitutional. One of them is a particular piece, what is called the complex monopoly provision. It's only ever been tried one other place in the world, and it was dumped. It's fiendishly complex. It's almost certainly unimplementable, and yet it's the kind of thing that has a chilling effect on investment, precisely in a country where you want to encourage the maximum amount of investment. So break it down for the layperson. What is the complexity behind it? What does it do to hinder investment? Essentially, collusive practices, that's very clear. Dominant players, that's clear. But if your behavior without any collusion, without talking to anybody else, can be interpreted intentionally or even unintentionally as having an anti-competitive impact, you can then be had up under this complex monopoly. Now, if you are having to think about everything you do for unintentioned consequences, really it makes all sorts of... You're never going to be able to make a decision. There's just too much red tape because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So I think that the interesting thing is that the competition authorities in the hearings last year joined forces with us on that. They said this frankly is unimplementable. But now you've lost this fight. Well, it hasn't been promulgated yet, and so there's a lot of discussion behind the scenes. The other one that we are currently having a discussion with the DTI on is the new Companies Act. And there are some provisions there, the business rescue provisions, equally, which would have had dramatic unintended consequences, especially in the financial sector and in some of the international dealings. And the consequence would have been to raise the cost of lending and borrowing and to have a chilling effect precisely at a time when we again saying please lend to companies that need to invest or to individuals who are in difficulty. Exactly what we don't need is to raise the cost of
Do you feel
lending.
that you're on the winning side of that challenge?
I think we've made some progress. In fact, we're having a meeting very shortly and we will be seeing exactly how much progress we've made.
Is the era of quiet diplomacy with the government over, in your opinion?
No, I think I go back to that phrase where I said we have to pick our battles carefully. We have to be a constructive and engaged partner, but one that at the appropriate moments is not afraid to voice criticism. We don't want to just parrot criticism at every particular moment. We're not an opposition party, and that's not to denigrate opposition parties in any way. They have their role. But we mustn't cry wolf at every turn and then end up not being listened to when we need to.
Is there concern among the CEOs that the government is perhaps starting to lean to the left?
Look, I don't think it's so much a case of leaning to the left. I think it's a case of being practical and not biting off more than you can chew. I think particularly coming back to, a lot of the political heat is around the question of delivery. Similarly, in terms of legislation that is passed, the difficulty is who's going to implement it. If there are capacity constraints in the public sector, if you pass what is world-class, in fact it's sort of Rolls-Royce legislation, which countries that have the most developed systems, that have the strongest civil servants, even they would struggle, how is it going to fly in South Africa? Maybe a little more modesty in terms of goal is necessary, and that's where you get the practical, pragmatic business approach trying to intersect with the politically ambitious role of government.
How's business reacting to the World Cup? We've spent some 100 billion rand on preparing for the World Cup, and obviously it's underway at the moment. Is business ultimately going to benefit from the World Cup legacy in South Africa?
Absolutely. It reminds me, one of the things I did when I was very young is I applied for an American Field Service scholarship. And one of the issues we had to debate is, should we be having a space program in the US? This was just at the time of the space, in fact, the moon landings. And you got the clear breakdown between those who said, it's too expensive, you should spend this money on housing, on so on. And others said, no, man does not live by bread alone. There are new frontiers. You energize the human race. New investment, new technology, new research will come from that. That's my approach to the World Cup. You can't just count it in rands and cents.